every thought that I had about Scream, also known as Scream 5, when I was watching this, contradicted the previous thought that I had. And this basically continued all the way through the film. Unlike my previous Scream discussions, most of the things I want to say are spoilers, so I'll say a few brief non-spoiler things first, but then I want to get into some specifics, which, as I said, is not how I did my previous Scream discussions, but there are some things that I really want to mention. If I had to give this a star rating, I couldn't, because part of me thought, wow, that was amazing, that bit was fantastic, I really want to praise this and that, and I will indeed in a moment give praise for specific things, but at the same time, there were things that I thought were just so overdone and so boring, and most of the new characters were really not even two-dimensional. They were just so cliche and dull, and I couldn't care less what happened to them. And when you have a horror where people are dying or are at risk of being killed, you kind of need to care about at least some of them. So it's not perfect. And I did worry when I was watching it that I'd get to the end of it not liking it. And the whole point of me binge watching, most of Scream in the course of, I think it's been 8 days maybe, is so I can watch the one that was released this year. But I will say, before I get in with spoilers, I ultimately enjoyed it, and I cannot wait for the next one, which I will be watching tomorrow, though I am slightly emotional that it's over. And this is by far the most emotional, not the best well written. In fact, I think in terms of the writing, the narrative structure, the pacing, the characters, kind of the weakest yet. But I will say, it is very well filmed, and the sound effects are amazing. There's one moment in particular, which is a spoiler, but there's one sound effect that genuinely made me feel sick to my stomach, and it's very bloody. I don't know for certain if it's the bloodiest so far, but it might well be. This, of course, was released in 2022. It's directed by Tyler Gillett and Matt Bettinelli-Olpin. Obviously not directed by Wes Craven, which I did think maybe that's why it's not as good, but actually I feel like it's not as good because it was trying too hard to be sophisticated. Yet again, we have teenagers sitting in a circle talking about horror and elevated horror, which is just a really weird way of saying thriller, because let's face it, a horror with deeper meaning is just a thriller, and name-dropping directors and other horror films, and I just thought, this is written by somebody who just wants to show off their horror knowledge. I get it, these are cliche, boring film fan students. This has been done before, give us something fresh. And that's the bit that I thought was really boring, and unfortunately a lot of those characters become, if not the main focus, at least quite heavily focused. And that's where I think the film was kind of letting itself down. It was being repetitive, it was cliche, the characters were boring and predictable, and that part of it I hated. However, even though those bits are repetitive, I do love the fact that we have characters back from the previous films. It's probably pretty obvious which characters have returned, but just in case it isn't, I mean, they're going to be in the thumbnail and the poster for this, as they are, but I'll just say, spoilers from now. I'm going to discuss some things in more detail, and some of these spoilers are big spoilers. So, definitely spoilers from now. And I have to say, first of all, the opening scene, it was a brilliant start. Jenna Ortega did an amazing job with that beginning scene. And it kind of... See, what I didn't like about this was when the idea was planted that maybe Tara was one of the killers, I thought, well, no, of course she isn't, you stupid idiot. Look at what happened in the first scene. That wasn't faked. So that's part of the bad writing, where things that are said, but, you know, they're trying to be clever and plant ideas, but it's not clever, because we have pretty solid evidence that that wasn't the case, so don't be an idiot. And there are other times when I just feel like it was trying too hard. It was basically saying, hey, I'm a film fan, I'm writing a horror film, I'm going to tell you all I know about horror films and write these really rubbish characters who are fans of elevated horror, which is actually just a thriller. And honestly, for me as a big horror fan, I would hate to spend time with those students. They really were really boring characters. thankfully, they weren't in it quite as much as they could have been, I guess. And when I said we had characters back, well, it's bittersweet, isn't it? Because we do have Dewey and we do have Gale, but they're no longer together, and that broke my heart. And what's even worse, and this is, as I said, a very big spoiler, but when it's not funny, it's terrible. I'm kind of in shock. When Dewey died, I cried. I absolutely couldn't handle it. I think it was made worse by the fact that his life was a mess. He'd lost Gale. I think at one point somebody said he'd hit the bottle, so I think he must have been drinking quite heavily. And his life had just fallen apart. And of course he had all these demons from these troubled, the troubled past and things. And he was down and out and then killed in that state, never having a chance to regain a sense of satisfaction in life. And it just... The kill scene itself wasn't that interesting. I mean, it was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. But it was just... It was hard. It was difficult. And apparently, he was meant to die in a previous film, but they filmed an alternative ending where he'd lived. And test audiences were in favour of that. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad that was the case, because he's a brilliant character. David Arquette gives a really great performance. And there are some really emotional scenes between Gale and Dewey here. It's also the first time I realised I like Sidney Prescott. I didn't, to begin with. And I think maybe for the first two Screams I didn't like her. But I was so relieved she was in this one, and reflecting back on the previous films, I think I started to like her around the third film. And the scenes between Sidney and Gale here, I loved. I absolutely loved them. There are characters in this I didn't really care for. Tara, I didn't mind, but I feel like after the initial scene, she wasn't that interesting, which is perhaps fair enough because she was severely injured. And, can't really contribute that much. But Sam, played by Melissa Barrera, again gave a fantastic performance. I feel like everybody's performances were great. Even the performances for the really boring characters, the other characters were... The performances were fine, the characters were just badly written in some places. I don't think Sam and Tara were badly written. But Sam just... I don't know, I never really felt a connection with that character, so I was never that bothered about her. But maybe it's the same with Sidney. Maybe it would take me a few films to get used to her. Who knows? But I didn't hate her. That's at least the case. With regards to who the killer was, I'm not surprised, but I found it to be quite predictable. I didn't work out who it was. Maybe it's not fair to say that it was predictable. But in previous Screams, the killer is always really surprising in a really fascinating, clever, intricately written way. And that's not the case here. I didn't think it was clever. I didn't think it was interesting. I may not have seen it coming, but that doesn't mean it's good. And I feel like this is the first time where the killer's been revealed and I just kind of thought, alright, whatever. It could have been anybody. It wasn't really a clever connection. The motivation wasn't really that interesting. I feel like that was a bit of a letdown. However, that scene, the final scenes in the house when the killers were revealed, wow. A couple of moments in there I absolutely adored. The fire, first of all, didn't see that coming. Absolutely incredible. The many, many, many stabs that Sam delivered were... the performance there was just incredible, and just the pace of those stabs and just how ferocious that was. It was incredible. But the bit that made me feel sick to the stomach was when Sam took a knife to the abdomen, and after about 30 seconds, or maybe a bit longer, the knife was twisted. Ugh! I can hear it. It's a mixture of squelching and crunching. And honestly, I kind of feel like she wouldn't have remained standing. There are a lot of things in this that don't seem believable to me. For example, when Sam was delivering what must have been 30 stabs, I don't think he would have been able to speak. I think if nothing else, I feel like he would have passed out from the trauma. I don't think he would have been able to speak and say, what about my ending? And, you know, corny dialogue. Some of the dialogue in this was really horrendous. Most of the bad dialogue is, again, from the film fan students. I just feel like they were terribly written characters with terrible, boring, cliche dialogue. And I just feel like if you're going to do a fifth film in a series, give us something different. And they kind of didn't give us anything different. But when it comes to Sidney and Gale and Dewey, I'm glad that that was the case. So it's not a well-written film. There are bits that are well executed. As I said, even Dewey's death wasn't very well done. It wasn't I just feel like his death could have been more important, more moving. Yes, you could argue he was there saving Tara, but I feel like it wasn't that powerful. His ending, the actual way it happened, wasn't that interesting, but the fact that it happened was emotional. You know, he could have died of a heart attack and it would have been emotional, but I feel like they could have done something, you know, like maybe on the top of a building, shooting him and letting him fall down to the ground and having that powerful shot of his body floating down. And, well, floating probably isn't the word, but there are ways where they could have made that a powerful image and could have kept that burned into our memories. But what we had was kind of boring and not that interesting. So actually, Scream 5 is pretty terrible. It's not a good film, but there are moments that were good. The camera work at the beginning with Tara and the initial scene, the camera work there was incredible. Really, really fantastic. And initially I thought this was going to be an amazingly shot film. After that point, the camera work wasn't bad. I don't think at any point I thought that it was badly filmed. But at the same time, I feel like it stopped being as interesting. So yeah, it's a pretty terrible film. But there were moments. The good moments are pretty good. I was going to say they're great, but no, that's a lie. They're not. They're fine. They're okay. Because I didn't realise this until this film, but I built an emotional connection with Gale, Sidney and Dewey. I didn't realise it in the previous films, but in this film it really hit me that I've built up a love for these characters over the past few weeks. That's why the film was good, because their moments were good. Most of the acting, in fact all of the acting, was good. Some great sound effects and some pretty decent filming. But as a narrative, it was terrible. It really was terrible. So I'm not expecting anything sensational from the next film, but I would now consider myself to be a very big Scream fan. And I kind of have to watch it immediately. Tomorrow. It's a bit late at night now. I feel like if I start watching it now, I won't stop. So I'll watch it tomorrow. But yeah, I've talked about this a lot longer than I expected to. And I feel like this is the film where I've had the most thoughts. And that's because, well, maybe it's a good thing. If a film makes me this annoyed at how bad it is, I'm talking about it more than the other films. So it must have done something right. It got me riled up. It stirred emotions in me. One could argue that strong emotions either way is the sign of an interesting film, if not necessarily a brilliant one. If you're a Scream fan and you got to the fourth and you haven't seen the fifth, do watch it. I mean, I've spoiled it all now, but either way, give it a watch. But by far, it is the weakest of the Screams so far.